The roar of the crowd in Rome's mighty amphitheaters was unlike anything else in the ancient world. To step into the Colosseum was to step into a storm of human emotion, cheers, gasps, and cries of bloodlust, a theater where life and death were treated as a spectacle. Stone upon stone, the Romans had built not only an arena, but a stage for cruelty, one where human dignity was stripped away for the entertainment of the masses. What many forget is that within this spectacle, countless men, women, and even children, often enslaved, often conquered people from foreign lands, were forced to perform in games that reduced them to little more than playthings of power. Behind the glitter of Rome's grandeur lived a darkness, a story of brutality that reveals more about human nature than about heroism. The Colosseum is often remembered as a marvel of engineering, but for those who were marched into its sands, it was a place of despair. They were the forgotten, prisoners of war, rebels, enslaved Africans, and those branded as criminals by a system that valued dominance above justice. These were people with names, with stories, with families who might never see them again. Yet in the eyes of the Roman crowd, they became faceless performers in a theater of cruelty. Imagine what it must have felt like hearing the deafening roar as the gates opened, stepping into blinding sunlight, knowing that death was not only likely, but demanded. One of the most chilling acts involved what the Romans called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. Men and women were thrown defenseless into the arena, forced to face lions, leopards, and bears without hope of survival. To the audience, it was spectacle. To the condemned, it was terror. There are accounts of entire groups of enslaved people being tied to stakes, while wild animals, starved to the point of madness, were released upon them. The screams were drowned by the cheers of thousands who had come to see blood, not humanity. What makes this even more disturbing is that many victims came from lands Rome had conquered: Africans, Gauls, Jews, and others turned into human sacrifices meant to demonstrate the empire's unyielding power. Their lives were reduced to symbols, their suffering converted into a message. Rome rules, and you are nothing. In some cases, the cruelty was disguised as theater. Instead of straightforward execution, elaborate reenactments were staged, blending myth with murder. Condemned prisoners would be forced to play the roles of figures from Roman mythology, except their parts ended in real death. One story tells of a man cast as Orpheus, the legendary musician, who was made to play the lyre while wild animals were released around him. At first, the beasts circled calmly, perhaps moved by the music, but soon they tore him apart to the delight of the crowd. It was theater, yes, but theater that mocked the very essence of humanity, turning art into a weapon of humiliation. The Romans prided themselves on discipline and order, yet inside the arena, chaos was deliberately staged. Emperors used these spectacles to reinforce their power. By offering free games, they won the loyalty of the masses, who were fed not just bread but also blood. The crowd became complicit in the cruelty, swept up in the ecstasy of violence. But imagine what it meant for the enslaved African warrior forced into battle, dragged far from his homeland, stripped of his freedom, and thrown into the sand not as a man but as entertainment. His struggle was not only against the beast before him, but against a system that denied his very humanity. There were times when even the audience gasped at the excess. Accounts describe emperors who pushed the games beyond endurance, turning punishment into endless torture. Under Nero and later Domitian, The arena became a place of grotesque experimentation. Prisoners were burned alive to illuminate night games, their bodies turned into human torches. Others were forced into battles so hopeless that survival was impossible from the start. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological. For many, days of waiting in dark cells beneath the Colosseum preceded their death, where the smell of blood seeped into the walls and the cries of the condemned echoed through the corridors. To wait in that silence, knowing the crowd above awaited your death as amusement, was itself a torment. Yet, within these horrors, there were also whispers of resistance and dignity. Not all entered the arena silently. Some spoke words of defiance, proclaiming their innocence or cursing the empire with their final breath. Others met death with unflinching courage, denying Rome the satisfaction of seeing them broken. In one recorded incident, a condemned man seized the wild beast meant to kill him and fought it barehanded, refusing to die as a passive victim. Though he was inevitably killed, his act became a silent protest against a system that sought to erase his identity. The cruelty of the arena reveals a deeper truth about Rome. Its greatness was built not only on roads and laws, but on blood and subjugation. The empire depended on enslaved labor, on the forced displacement of people, on stripping conquered nations of their dignity. The games were a mirror of that reality, designed to remind everyone that Rome's power was absolute. But the cost was staggering. Entire communities were traumatized, entire cultures scarred, entire lives erased for the sake of a day's amusement. For those from Africa, Judea, or Gaul, the arena was not only a place of death but a symbol of what Rome thought of them: expendable, inferior, and voiceless. It is here that the story touches us most deeply, because it is not only about Rome, it is about the human tendency to look away when cruelty is dressed as entertainment. The same emotions that filled the Colosseum, the thrill of dominance, the dismissal of other lives as lesser, have echoed through centuries. In plantations, in lynchings, in public spectacles of humiliation. The cries of the condemned in Rome are not so distant from the cries of those who faced whips, chains, and execution in later ages. At the core, it is the same wound, the stripping away of dignity, the denial of humanity, and the crowd's complicity in cruelty. When we remember Rome's arenas, we are not just remembering architecture. We are remembering the men and women who walked into those sands with dignity, even when stripped of everything else. They remind us that cruelty may dominate for a time, but human courage and memory endure. To tell their story is to reclaim their humanity, to say that they were not nameless, not faceless, not forgotten. They were people, and their suffering still speaks to us across the centuries. Beneath the marble arches and beneath the echoing cheers, Rome's arenas told stories, not of victory, but of silence, the silence of those whose names history tried to erase. For every emperor remembered in stone, there were thousands of men and women remembered only in the sands, their blood washed away after each spectacle. If Part 1 showed the cruelty of the arena, Part 2 must show how those brutal acts reached too far, even for Rome itself. Because there comes a point when cruelty ceases to be entertainment and becomes an indictment of the very civilization that carries it out. The games were meant to display strength, yet they often revealed Rome's weakness, its addiction to domination, its hunger for control, and its disregard for the very values it claimed to uphold. The Romans liked to boast of their law, their discipline, their sense of order. But when tens of thousands screamed for the slow death of a prisoner, what law was left? What order remained when the state itself turned execution into sport? By giving the mob what it craved, emperors surrendered to the darkest instincts of humanity. Consider the staged naval battles, the Naumachia, where entire lakes were flooded, or the Colosseum itself was transformed into a watery battlefield. Thousands of enslaved men, chained together, were forced to reenact sea battles from Rome's past. But unlike myth, these ships carried real people, and the combat ended only with bodies floating lifeless on the surface. Some of these men were prisoners of conquered nations, others were criminals, and still others were simply swept up in Rome's relentless need for spectacle. The crowd marveled at the engineering, the scale, the illusion of power, but to those forced into the boats, it was drowning, burning, bleeding. Rome had turned memory into murder, history into horror. Sometimes the cruelty took on forms so inventive that even hardened spectators were unsettled. Ancient accounts describe criminals dressed as characters from myths, who suffered the same fates as their legendary counterparts. A man playing Icarus was flung from a high contraption, crashing to his death before the eyes of thousands. Another, playing Hercules, was burned alive to imitate the hero's fiery end. To the crowd, it was drama. To the condemned, it was torture disguised as art. One must ask, how far must a society go when it begins to call cruelty culture? Among the most disturbing acts were those inflicted upon women and children. While most gladiators were men, history records women being forced into the arena as well. Sometimes to fight one another, sometimes to be hunted like animals. The Roman appetite for novelty meant that nothing was off limits. Children of condemned families were sometimes forced to witness their parents' deaths before being executed themselves. It was cruelty designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to erase entire bloodlines from memory. Rome prided itself on civilization, but what kind of civilization finds joy in destroying families for entertainment? For the enslaved African warriors who found themselves under Rome's rule, the arena was not just a punishment, it was a stage of a way to declare that they were less than human. Stripped of their identities, their languages, their cultures, they were paraded as exotic enemies, their deaths a symbol of Rome's supposed superiority. Yet even in this, dignity found a way to survive. Some fought bravely, refusing to beg for mercy, meeting death on their own terms. Their courage haunted the crowd, a reminder that even when the empire took everything, it could not kill the human spirit. That defiance was a kind of victory, silent but enduring. The brutality went too far, not only for the victims, but eventually for Rome itself. The empire spent enormous wealth and manpower staging these spectacles, sometimes bankrupting itself to satisfy the crowd's hunger for blood. Emperors built larger, more elaborate shows, desperate to outshine their predecessors, but the cost was staggering, not only in coin, but in morality. As cruelty became routine, Rome dulled its own capacity for compassion. A society that could cheer the tearing apart of men and women by wild beasts had lost something essential, something that could not be regained by law or conquest. And there were those in Rome who began to question it. Philosophers like Seneca warned that the games degraded the soul, that watching cruelty made people cruel themselves. Early Christian voices condemned the arena as a place where humanity was sacrificed on the altar of entertainment. Slowly, whispers of resistance grew, until centuries later, The games themselves would be abandoned not because Rome had lost its appetite for violence, but because it had lost the ability to afford such excess. In the end, the cruelty of the games consumed the empire that created them. But the story does not end with Rome's fall. The echoes of the Colosseum have carried forward through history. The public executions of the medieval period, the slave auctions of the Atlantic world, the lynchings in the American South, each was a theater of cruelty, where human dignity was stripped away in front of a watching crowd. The same dynamic repeated. Those in power staged suffering as spectacle, while the crowd's gaze transformed cruelty into entertainment. The wounds of the Colosseum are therefore not confined to Rome. They are wounds that belong to humanity. When we revisit Rome's arenas today, walking through the ruins where stone arches rise like ghosts of the past, we cannot simply admire the engineering. We must remember the lives that were lost. There, the African fighter torn from his homeland, the child condemned for his father's rebellion, the woman forced to play a role in a myth only to die for the crowd's amusement. To remember them is to restore what Rome tried to erase, their humanity. Their stories matter because they remind us that even when power tries to reduce people to objects, those people remain human, with dreams, with dignity, with voices that still whisper across centuries. It is tempting to dismiss Rome's cruelty as something distant, something alien, but to do so is to miss the point. The Colosseum is not only a monument of the past, it is a mirror. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Do we still find ways to enjoy suffering when it is not ours? Do we turn away from cruelty when it benefits us? Do we cheer for violence when it is dressed as justice? The answers matter because the line between Rome and today is thinner than we like to admit. The most brutal and inhumane acts of the arena went too far because they crossed the threshold where entertainment became dehumanization. They remind us that no civilization, no matter how mighty, can survive when it builds itself on the denial of others' humanity. Rome's glory has faded, its emperors are gone, but the stories of the men and women who suffered in the arenas remain. And in remembering them, we reclaim something vital not only for them, but for ourselves. So when we stand before the ruins of the Colosseum, let us not only see stone, let us hear the cries of those who entered the arena with no chance of survival. Let us honor their courage, their resistance, their dignity in the face of unspeakable cruelty. Because, in telling their story, we refuse to let cruelty be forgotten. We refuse to let their humanity be erased. And we remind ourselves that every act of remembrance is itself an act of justice. Rome's arenas sought to bury the voices of the condemned under the roar of the crowd. Today, we let those voices rise again. They tell us that cruelty may build empires, but it cannot sustain them. Dignity, even in death, endures longer than domination. That is the true lesson of the Colosseum. Not the glory of Rome, but the courage of those who suffered beneath it. Their story still lives because we choose to remember.